I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare Anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare Anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode. Welcome to another Shakespeare Anyone mini-episode. In these mini-episodes, we'll be exploring topics that are related to Shakespeare but aren't necessarily connected to whatever play we've been discussing.
And they're mini because, well, they're shorter than our other episodes. They're like quartos if the regular episodes are folio editions.
Have you ever wondered where those colorful Folger paperback editions of Shakespeare plays got their name? Or how the Folger Shakespeare Library came to have the largest collection of First Folios in the world? Or if there was any relation to the coffee brand?
In today's episode, we are going to be exploring the life of Henry Folger, his wife Emily Jordan Folger, their quest for copies of the First Folio, and how their collection forever changed our modern understanding of Shakespeare and the early modern period.
Henry Clay Folger Jr. was born on June 18, 1857, in New York City. He was the oldest of 8 children born to Henry Clay Folger Sr., a wholesale millinery dealer, and Elizabeth Jane Clark. As a child, Henry attended public school in Brooklyn, eventually earning commendations and a scholarship to the Adelphi Academy, a private preparatory school. While at Adelphi, Henry met Charles Millard Pratt, son of the businessman and one of the founders of Adelphi Academy, Charles Pratt. Henry graduated in the top 5 of his graduating class from Adelphi, and with the encouragement of one of Adelphi's teachers, Henry and Charles Millard Pratt entered Amherst College in the fall of 1875.
Henry started college around the same time that Shakespeare started to become part of the curriculum in American colleges. During his first year, Henry's 7-year-old brother gifted him a copy of the complete works of William Shakespeare, which Henry began to read for his college courses and for his own enjoyment. In addition to Shakespeare, Henry studied, quote, Greek, history, Latin, math, orthography, declamation, and literature, unquote, while at Amherst.
Henry's first 2 years of college would not be unrecognizable to modern college students. He was not wealthy, lived in a very modest dormitory, learned how to do his own laundry, and spent much of his time studying, attending lectures, and enjoying time with his friends. He and his friend Charles Millard Pratt joined Alpha Delta Phi fraternity, and Henry participated in the fraternity's Shakespeare discussion group.
In his junior year, Henry's father's business failed, and his family could no longer afford to pay tuition and expenses for Henry's education at Amherst. Henry moved back home to Brooklyn and enrolled at the tuition-free City College of New York. This was short-lived, however, as his friend, Charles Millard Pratt, and another friend, William M. Ladd, arranged for a personal loan from Pratt's father to cover Henry's school expenses. Henry also participated in oratorical essay contests, earning prizes that also helped pay for his final years of schooling. Henry would later credit a Shakespeare-related essay contest as sparking his interest in Shakespeare, which was further ignited by a lecture by Ralph Waldo Emerson that Henry attended in his senior year.
Henry graduated Phi Beta Kappa, was the recipient of the prestigious Hyde Prize at his commencement ceremony, and ranked 5th in his graduating class. Upon graduation in 1879, Henry had a choice between 3 potential jobs: to stay at Amherst as a tutor, to teach public speaking in Minnesota, or to take a position as a clerk in the company owned by his best friend's father. He chose the latter and, a week after graduation, began working for Charles Pratt's Astral Oil Works, which by this time had secretly and silently merged with John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company.
For the next few years, Henry worked during the day to pay off his private loans, took classes at Columbia Law School at night, and pursued his emerging literary interests in whatever free time he had. In 1881, he fully repaid the loan he had received from Charles Pratt, graduated with a law degree cum laude from Columbia, and was working as a clerk in the manufacturing committee at Standard Oil of New Jersey.
As a clerk, Henry was analyzing all phases of Standard Oil's refining operations and analyzing cost and yield statistics, and presenting his findings to the chair of the manufacturing committee, H. Rogers, with a copy forwarded to Rockefeller. On May 1, 1881, at 23 years old, Henry Folger issued Manufacturing Book A, which compiled and illustrated data on all of Standard Oil Company's phases in refining crude oil. As a result of his reports, he was promoted to Secretary of the Manufacturing Company in 1886, later became part of the management of the refinery, and 5 years after joining management, he became the chairman of the manufacturing company.
In 1882, Henry attended a gathering of the Irving Literary Society, where he was introduced to Emily Clara Jordan. Born in Ohio, Emily grew up in Washington, D.C., the daughter of the solicitor for the Treasury Department under Presidents Lincoln and Johnson. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Vassar College in 1879. During her time at Vassar, she was elected the president of her class of 36 women, and she was accomplished in the subjects of English composition and astronomy. Her roommate and good friend at Vassar was none other than Lily Richardson Pratt, sister to Henry's friend, Charles Millard Pratt.
Henry and Emily connected over their shared love of Shakespeare, as the Pratt siblings encouraged both of them to give a toast during that 1882 meeting of the Irving Literary Society. During their respective speeches, Henry quoted As You Like It, and Emily referenced Othello. They were married October 6, 1885, and first lived with Henry's parents in Brooklyn before renting homes of their own. In their first year of marriage, Henry purchased a reduced-size facsimile of the First Folio for Emily for $1.25, approximately $40 in 2025. This edition was part of a wave of facsimile editions that were popular at the end of the 19th century due to Shakespeare's growing popularity. Presenting the gift, he wrote in a note, quote, "Here you may see Shakespeare's plays as they were actually given to the world," unquote.
Henry and Emily continued to add to their personal libraries during their early years of marriage. Henry wrote to his college class historian that, in the decade after graduation, he had managed to assemble a, quote-unquote, modest library of good volumes of important literature. However, their transition from typical readers of the time into collectors of rare books began one day in 1889, when Henry wandered into Bang's auction house in Manhattan and purchased an otherwise unremarkable copy of Shakespeare's Fourth Folio for $107.50, equal to approximately $3,828 in 2025, which was more than he could afford at the time, so the auction house let him have 30 days to pay the total.
A few years later, sometime between 1891 and 1893, the Folgers purchased their first copy of the First Folio. This copy of the First Folio was a flawed specimen, missing much of the front material, and with one play, The Merry Wives of Windsor, made up of pages from another First Folio. Unfortunately, and uncharacteristically, Henry did not retain a record of how much he paid for this First Folio, or where he purchased it. However, given the condition of the volume and the rare book market at the time, biographers and historians doubt that the Folgers would have paid more than $1,000 for the book.
The Shakespeareana collecting bug had bitten Henry Folger, although he did not have the financial means to purchase every piece of Shakespeare-related material he coveted. Relatable. In 1895, excited by the opportunity to purchase a large lot of Shakespeare volumes from a London bookseller, but unable to afford the cost of the bulk purchase, Henry wrote to his boss, John D. Rockefeller, to try and convince one of the richest men in the country to buy the books. Henry suggested to Rockefeller that purchasing a bunch of rare books related to Shakespeare and donating them to the new University of Chicago was a good business decision, and that Rockefeller could publish and sell reproductions of some of the most important items in the lot as a way to recoup the financial investment. Rockefeller declined Henry's proposition, and the collection was purchased by another collector.
The next year, Henry purchased another copy of the First Folio for $4,500. It was the most expensive purchase he had made yet. In 2025 dollars, Folger paid roughly $170,181 for a single book. This purchase marked a turning point for the Folgers as they started to get serious about Shakespeare scholarship and collecting Shakespeareana. They started to correspond with Horace Howard Furness, a famous Shakespeare scholar in Pennsylvania, who became a mentor to both Henry and Emily in their exploration of Shakespeare.
Furness advised Emily on her pursuit of a graduate degree, outlining a course of study for her and becoming her master's thesis advisor. In a time when it was unusual for a woman to pursue graduate studies and literary scholarship, Emily studied how Shakespeare's plays were edited and published over time. She earned her master's degree from Vassar in 1896, and her thesis, entitled The True Text of Shakespeare, explored how to determine the most accurate versions of the plays as Shakespeare wrote them. According to a rare book dealer who interacted with the Folgers, Emily's formal training made her an expert advisor to her husband as he shopped for manuscripts and rare books.
In 1897, Henry got a tip that a large private English collection of rare Shakespeare books, including 4 First Folios and 22 quartos, might be coming up for sale, but the tipster declined to share who the current owner was. Luckily for Henry, his financial situation had greatly improved since the last time he attempted to purchase a large collection of Shakespeare. This time, Henry Folger engaged a London-based book dealer to find the owner and, if the collection was worth it, purchase it via a private deal before the collection went to auction. The book dealer discovered that the collection was recently inherited by the 5th Earl of Warwick after the death of his father. Good news for Henry. The new Earl was not too interested in his father's dusty books, but had not committed to selling them at auction.
The London book dealer secured the Warwick lot for Folger on April 3, 1897. Then, within 3 days, packaged the entire trove and sent it off to New York City. For $50,000, or just under $2 million in 2025 money, Henry Folger was now the owner of 7 copies of the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th Folios, priceless copies of the 1599 quarto of Romeo and Juliet and the 1600 first quarto of The Merchant of Venice, hundreds of other books, pieces of artwork, and manuscripts, and, last but not least, one of the very rare so-called perfect copies of the First Folio. Given the high quality of this copy of the First Folio, both Henry and the book dealer could have estimated its value alone to be between $2,500 to $4,000, or between $98,000 and $158,000 in 2025 dollars. Henry would manage to keep his purchase of the Warwick collection a secret from the public for over 20 years.
With his 3rd First Folio in possession, Henry Folger now owned more copies of the First Folio than anyone else in America. And as of 1897, the Folgers' collection of books was now too big to store at home. They rented warehouse space and carefully cataloged and inventoried each item before packing it away. The Folgers continued to hunt for rare Shakespeareana, and as their collection grew, so did their expense. Eventually, both Henry and Emily were known for being as skilled as the best book dealers in spotting true First Folios, rather than fraudulent facsimiles, and evaluating the rare book's condition.
Henry continued to avoid attending major rare book auctions. He felt that maintaining anonymity would help keep prices lower on the books he wanted to buy, and since most auctions for Shakespeare-related items took place in London, he also saved on travel expenses. Outside of their wildly expensive collecting hobby, The Folgers lived frugally. They also maintained secrecy around their hobby to such an extent that when the English Shakespeare scholar Sir Sidney Lee published a census in 1902 listing 156 known copies of the First Folio in existence, only one of the 6 copies then owned by the Folgers was included.
In 1903, Henry finished a 4-year-long negotiation over one of the rarest editions of the First Folio yet discovered, a copy that had been presented to Augustine Vincent by the original printer Isaac Jaggard. This copy, which Henry would catalog as the Vincent Folio, became one of his most prized possessions and set Henry off in a flurry of additional folio purchases, although none in as excellent or rare condition as the Vincent. In 1904, Henry was promoted to assistant manager of Standard Oil Works, and as he continued to purchase First Folios in any condition, in 1905 he purchased the only known copy of the 1594 quarto of Titus Andronicus.
Even though Henry was successful at keeping his personal identity a secret, with his purchase of the Titus Andronicus quarto and the Vincent Folio, the rare book world became acutely aware of the presence of at least one American millionaire who was buying rare Shakespeare materials. When a copy of the First Folio that had originally been given by Isaac Jaggard to the Bodleian Library at Oxford was rediscovered, English collectors and scholars, who could not outbid a wealthy American on their own, worked together in a sort of early 1900s crowdfunding effort to prevent the book's purchase by an American. Through amassing many small donations, they were able to raise enough money to match Henry's bid, which allowed the Bodleian to buy back the exact copy that left their collection in 1664.
Henry's career at Standard Oil continued to rise, and in 1911, following the Supreme Court's decision in Standard Oil Company of New Jersey versus United States, which ordered the company to dissolve within 6 months, Henry's voice was second only to John D. Rockefeller's in determining how the company would be split up. Henry was later appointed the president of the second largest of the new companies created from the Standard Oil split, which would be known as the Standard Oil Company of New York. By the end of 1911, Henry owned 40 copies of the First Folio, just 10 fewer than the entirety of England, though his status as a collector remained secret as his identity as a businessman became ever more public.
Despite now being part of the super wealthy class, the Folgers continued to live in their rented Brooklyn home that a visitor described as modest but filled with books. Unlike other wealthy collectors like Henry E. Huntington and J. Pierpont Morgan, who were much wealthier than Folger and spent $1 million a year each on rare books of any sort, Henry and Emily remained the only rare book collectors solely focused on collecting First Folios.
And they continued to remain secretive about their hobby. In 1916, Great Britain and America celebrated the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's death with lectures, performances, exhibitions, and the publication of books, articles, and more Shakespeareana. The Folgers basically ignored the various celebrations and declined to participate in any related events, including declining a request from the New York Public Library for a loan from his collection. The Folgers apparently only made one gesture to honor Shakespeare that year. They made a cash donation to help finance a project that would convert, quote, an existing garden in Central Park to one dedicated to plants mentioned in Shakespeare's plays, unquote.
The First World War had little impact on Henry's purchase of Shakespeare books. He purchased 10 copies between 1916 and 1918 and paid for special insurance against the risk of transporting them by boat from England to America when they might be sunk by German submarines. However, his business dealings with a bookseller from Philadelphia, Dr. Abraham Simon Wolfe Rosenbach, made headlines in 1919 for Henry's $100,000 purchase of 57 books. Nearly $2 million in today's money, the purchase included the Pavier Quarto, a copy of the pirated False Folio published in 1619 by William Jaggard, before the creation of the authorized First Folio. The New York Times published details about the sale and Henry's entire collection, which at the time surpassed 20,000 items.
After avoiding publicity for his entire collecting career, Folger was outraged and knew that the only person who could have provided information to the Times was Rosenbach. The New York Times continued to publish articles that named Henry as the owner of one of the largest collections of Shakespeareana in the world, much to Henry's displeasure and embarrassment. Articles about the American collector who paid so much money for a book circulated around the world. However, Henry's newfound fame as, quote, the man who had paid the highest price in the world for a book, unquote, did not deter Henry and Emily from continuing to search for First Folios. And now, every bookseller's first call when they found a rare copy of Shakespeare was to Henry Folger.
By the summer of 1920, Henry Folger, at the age of 63, possessed 59 First Folios, more than any institution or individual in the world, along with thousands of other printed materials about Shakespeare. He was the most famous Shakespeare collector, but he had never been able to behold his entire collection at once, as he did not have a personal library that could hold every piece of Shakespeare ephemera he had in storage. Henry began to think about what would happen to his collection after his and Emily's deaths. They had no children who would inherit the collection, and Henry knew that without a better plan, their collection would be broken up and sold to the highest bidders upon their deaths.
So, the Folgers began to imagine building a library to hold all of their books. Not a private library, but a public research center for scholars, an institution for Shakespeare studies. They considered several locations for the library: Amherst, Massachusetts, Nantucket, Massachusetts, the University of Chicago, Stratford-upon-Avon, New York City, and finally, his wife's childhood home, Washington, D.C.
The Folgers found a desirable area in Capitol Hill, and Henry started secretly buying individual lots on a historic block-long stretch of brick row houses originally known as Grant's Row. It would take 9 years for Henry to purchase all of the properties on Grant's Row, during which time he continued to purchase First Folios, grow in his fame as a collector of Shakespeare, and be elected chairman of the board of Standard Oil of New York, the position he would stay in until he retired. This new position further enhanced Henry's financial status, and, with that, he was able to purchase First Folios at any price with increasing regularity.
In 1928, Henry Folger retired from Standard Oil, purchased the first home that he and Emily would own, instead of rent, on Long Island, and finalized the purchase of the final home on Grant's Row. When the Library of Congress considered Grant's Row as a potential location for a new annex, Henry reached out to the Librarian of Congress and revealed the plans for the Shakespeare Library at the same site, appealing to the librarian as a potential ally in the creation of a world-class Shakespeare Institute. The librarian was supportive and worked with Folger to convince Congress to remove Grant's Row from their proposal for a site for the annex.
Henry and Emily worked with architects Alexander Trowbridge and Paul Philippe Crête to design a building that, from the outside, was modern and fit in with the other government buildings on Capitol Hill, but on the inside resembled spaces from Elizabethan and Jacobean England. 1928 would be the final year where Henry purchased any new copies of the First Folio, bringing his total collection to 82 copies, before he had to focus his spending on the design of the library that would house them all. And focus he did. Almost every aesthetic and practical choice made in the design and construction of the library as it exists today can be traced back to a letter or memo from Henry to his architects.
Demolition on Grant's Row commenced on November 11, 1929. The stock market crash a few weeks earlier meant that Henry had less money to spend on buying books, as the construction of the library took up the majority of Henry's available funds. In May 1930, as the architects were making final preparations to begin building, Henry underwent what he and Emily believed would be a minor prostate surgery. However, 3 weeks later, his doctors determined that he would need a second surgery. Unfortunately, Henry was not able to bear the strain of the second surgery and succumbed to a pulmonary embolism on June 11th.
After his funeral 2 days later, Emily chose to cremate Henry's remains. She had no doubt that the library would be completed, and she knew that his will established a generous endowment to cover operating costs for the library for years. However, the majority of his assets were investments, specifically many shares in the Standard Oil companies, and the stock market crash of 1929 had depleted his estate. However, Emily vowed to continue the work on the library, even though the assets Henry accumulated in life would no longer afford to build it, and, without the assets, Emily would be unable to sustain the library.
Henry's will stipulated that the endowment he established be administered by the trustees of Amherst College. On Halloween 1930, Emily transferred ownership of the library and collection to the trustees of Amherst. Using her own funds, she paid off the mortgage on the library and agreed to not immediately demand payment for money she had personally loaned Henry to buy items for the collection. According to Emily, construction on the library was not delayed due to Henry's death, and in fall 1931, the first armored trucks began to transfer the Folgers' collection from New York to Washington, D.C.
It would take 6 months to transport the contents of 2,109 crates of books, manuscripts, artwork, furniture, and other Shakespeare ephemera that the Folgers had stored in multiple storage rooms of multiple commercial warehouses. The first storage room had been rented for 34 years, and most rooms had been undisturbed for decades. Only thanks to Henry and Emily's meticulous record-keeping was every single crate found and transferred to D.C. It would take years for the library staff to completely catalog and organize the collection of over 256,000 books, 60,000 manuscripts, and more.
The Folger Library was opened on April 23, 1932, even though the collection was not completely cataloged and the building was not completely finished. During the day's events, which were broadcast nationally on the radio, Emily presented the key to the library and the trustees of Amherst College and quoted King Henry IV Part 1 as she spoke, quote, "Shakespeare says for Mr. Folger and me, quote, I would you would accept of grace and love, unquote, this key. It's the key to our hearts, unquote." Later that year, Emily was awarded an honorary doctorate from Amherst College. She was the third woman to receive an honorary degree from the college.
The first few years of the Folger Library were haphazard, as thousands of items in the collection remained inaccessible to scholars until they were cataloged. In 1936, Emily passed away after a decline in health. She left the library a substantial sum to ensure its future, and an unusual bequest: that her and Henry's remains be entombed behind a plaque in a wall of a passageway that leads to staircases and a balcony that overlooks the old reading room. Henry and Emily remain the only American philanthropists whose final resting place is within their creation.
Today, the Folger Shakespeare Library is still home to the world's largest Shakespeare collection. Without the work of Henry and Emily, the resources available in the library would still likely be in the possession of private collectors and inaccessible to scholars. It is impossible to imagine how different our modern understanding of Shakespeare and the early modern era would be today without the collection. Certainly making this podcast would be a very different experience. For one specific example, without access to Henry and Emily's collection of multiple copies of the First Folio, scholars would not have been able to compare copies side by side and make inferences about the printing process behind the First Folio.
The library continues to advance modern appreciation and understanding of Shakespeare through public events such as performances, lectures, and the Shakespeare Unlimited podcast, developing educational resources and training for teachers, including the publication of the Folger Shakespeare editions of plays, and serving as an international center for the study of Shakespeare and the early modern era.
Oh, and to answer the question you've probably been wondering since we mentioned it in our introduction, there is a connection between the Folger Library and Folger's Coffee.
Henry Folger's uncle founded the coffee company in San Francisco in 1850.
And that's Henry and Emily Folger and their search for Shakespeare's First Folio.
Thank you for listening.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at shakespeareanyonepod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you. From As You Like It, Act 5, Scene 1, said by Touchstone. Trip, Audrey, I attend, I attend.